Greetings and salutations. Welcome to video number 2 in the series where I tell you about some of my adventures in nearly 40 years of working in radio and sometimes television. This time around, we're going to talk about the summer of 1988. This was between my junior and senior year in high school, and I was attending classes at WFOS. We talked about that in the last video. And during that summer, I wanted to do some sort of internship at a commercial radio or television station. I remember that was the goal. I didn't know quite where I was going to do it. I could have done it locally here in town. But my brother had decided that he was going to stay in Berea, Kentucky, where he was going to school. He went to Berea College, a very famous college in the eastern part of the state of Kentucky. And Berea is very interesting because it is a special kind of school where the kids can work their way through. The college actually takes care of most of the services in the town, but the town does have an independent local radio station. The college has a radio station as well. And my brother went down and talked to the man who owned that station at that time and asked if they would be interested in having somebody come help out during the summer. And they said yes. So somewhere along the way, I was able to wangle plane tickets out there from where I was and a small stipend to give me a little bit of money to live on while I was there from the Virginia Commission for the Blind. They looked at it as a training opportunity for somebody who was visually impaired, and apparently they had a program for something like that, so that was cool. Threw that in there. So I was all set to go, and I think I got some college credits out of the deal as well. And I know I got a couple of high school credits because I desperately needed those. I was trying to catch up on classes because before I had made it out to WFOS, I had failed a lot of classes, so I was playing catch-up this whole time. So I was really stoked and ready to go and packed up my stuff, and went down to the airport, got on the airplane, flew to Pittsburgh, connected from Pittsburgh to Lexington. When I got there, there was a shuttle that took me to Berea, and there I was. And I showed up at my brother's apartment. He had a nice apartment in a house on, I wanted to say Chestnut Street. No, it was Center Street. Chestnut Street was where the radio station was. And by the way, it was about a good mile and a half from where he lived to downtown where the radio station was. You almost had to cross the entire town to get there. And the next day, I got there and I went to the radio station and walked down there and showed up and said, "This is who I am." And they were like, "Oh, okay, you're here. That's cool." And I talked to the guy who owned the place, who was a very nice gentleman named Bob Spradlin. And I asked him, I said, "Well, what is it exactly that you want me to do?" And he said, "Well, let me give you the dime tour, and then if you would show up tomorrow morning for sign-on." Now, this was a daytime AM radio station, and they're weird animals. A daytime station is usually a low-power station that is sneaking on to the frequency of what is known as a clear channel station in the United States. So that would be like a 50,000 watt AM that doesn't have anything to interfere with it. However, during the day, because of the fact that the radio waves don't bounce around like they do at night, you can sneak a low-power station on and it won't interfere with anybody. This station was on 1500, which is allocated to Washington, D.C. That's WTOP's frequency, and they are definitely clear channel. So these stations can only operate during daylight, and they have a schedule that they have to go by. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. But so I was like, okay. And he told me that there would be a fellow there who I would meet, and his name would be Dick Moon, and he was the news guy there. And no, I'm not making that up. That's that dude's real name. he turned out to be a very interesting fellow. So I said thank you, and he gave me a key, and I went back and got settled in and set my alarm clock and got up the next morning really early, like 4:30, and got dressed in the dark and tried not to wake up my brother and his roommate, and snuck out of the house and walked through this absolutely dead, silent town to this radio station. And that was quite the experience. It was pitch dark. The sun had not come up yet. There was nothing moving. There were no cars on the street. There was nobody out and about. Being a kid who grew up in the city, I had never seen anything like this. It was amazing to me. I remember I got to a major intersection where there was a traffic light, and there was nothing coming in any direction. And as I crossed the street there and got to the other side where the control box was for the traffic light, I could actually hear the relays, the switches, as it changed the light. The light was just cycling even though there wasn't any cars. So I walked my way all the way down to Chestnut Street where the radio station was, and my key worked, and I got in, and there was nobody there. And I think that since this was the later part of June, as I recall, the date was June the 20th. I think that was when I was supposed to start at the radio station. So I had come in the day before on the 19th. And there was nobody there. And I was by myself. And so I said, well, I guess I can go look around. So I went and went into the studio and sat down at the console, the one you see in the picture here. And there was a new log for that day laying there, and it started out at, I believe that it was 5:45 was sign on. I could be wrong, but it was something like that. And so I kept waiting for somebody else to show up, and nobody showed up, and the clock was going, and I'm looking up at that clock right there going, well, this radio station is supposed to sign on here in about 10 minutes. Maybe I ought to figure out how to do this. So the way that you controlled the transmitter for this radio station was by telephone. And this was one of the earliest systems like that. It was, you would pick up the phone and you would call the transmitter, and the phone would answer, and I think it said something like it was a robot voice, WKXO transmitter. Please enter your code now. And you had to put in some code, and that was your way in. It was a password. So you put it in, and then there were simple instructions. You could turn the transmitter on or off, or you could raise or lower the power, and that was about it. So this was actually easy to figure out. So I said, okay, so I called the transmitter, made sure I got that right. I was like, okay, I hung up the phone. I said, I'll call it when I'm ready to sign it on. So now I'm sitting in the studio, and I'm looking through the log, and now I'm trying to find commercials for like the first hour so I can start playing stuff. And I knew that they had ABC News, so I would have to back time into that at 6 o'clock. And where does that come up on the board? And how do you do that? And looking at the cartridges, like, where is the legal ID and all this stuff. Now the music was no big deal, because in the picture, see right here, you see all these cartridges that are stacked up next to me to my right. That was all of the current music. That was the top 40. And then as far as the oldies were concerned, they had a big library in the back of 45s, and I use the word library very loosely because nothing was in order. You would essentially go back there and grab a box of 45s and just kind of randomly pull them out and play them. So that was how the playlist was managed at this station. It was divine randomness. I'm glad I wasn't there when they had to do a report to the BMI or ASCAP, because you would have had to have sat down and written down all the songs that you played, because there wasn't any way to do it. They didn't have any music scheduling system. It was all just rotate whatever was in the box and whatever's on those tapes there. So when it came up time to sign the radio station on, I just picked up the phone, called the transmitter, and put in the code and put in the right numbers to turn the transmitter on. and this robot voice on the other end said, "Plates are on." And there was a radio sitting on a desk outside of the studio, and I heard all the static go away. So I knew we were on the air for real. So I grabbed a legal ID and played it in the cart machine there. And then I played a song. And then at the end of the song, I had to talk. And I turned on the microphone, and I couldn't think of anything to say. I just choked right up. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know anything about this radio station. I was like, it was a bizarre, surreal experience. It was like a dream. So I just pushed another button and played another song or whatever. So finally I got my voice and, said, "Good morning, my name is Joe Collins and this is WKXO." And I have no idea what I'm talking about. And I get into the news, and I didn't even know where to get the weather or any of that kind of stuff. And about, I would say, 6:15, this very large man walks in the radio station, and he comes bounding up to the studio there. It was kind of like a storefront in this place. The whole front end was kind of open, and it was offices, and there was a big counter in there. And then the studios were in the back. And he comes walking along that big long counter and walks down, and he says, "Who are you?" And I told him who I was and that was here to do an internship. And he said, "Well, you did this wrong and you did that wrong and you forgot to do this." I said, "This is my first day, and I was told somebody was going to be here." And he looked at me and he said, "Do you mean Bob sent you in here without training you at all?" I said, "No, I got the quick tour and I kind of figured out what to do." He said, "Oh my God." So that was really fun. He did the news, and I think the first newscast was the first local newscast was at 6:30. So he kind of was coaching me all morning long about, okay, you do this now and you do that, whatever. It was really something. And of course, I was a ball of nerves and scared to death. It took me a long time to calm down and get used to doing that. And this is when I found out that I was not cut out to do morning radio. Because apparently what they wanted me to do was come down there about 6 o'clock every morning and stay until about 3 in the afternoon. And that's a long way to go. And of course it was a college town, and there was always a lot going on. And my brother's apartment was sort of a meeting place for all of his friends. And so at night there was always a bunch of people hanging around. And since I was sleeping in a sleeping bag on the couch in the living room, that made things difficult sometimes, where I would have to go off in the other room and go to bed, and then I would have to. It was crazy. But after about a week or two, I got the hang of it, and Dick was nice enough to get up a little earlier and pick me up in his little Dodge Omni and drive me into work instead of me having to walk like a mile and a half through the town. And so it worked out fine. I was there for probably about 2 weeks, and we had a heat wave. And they were talking about the temperature going up to 101 degrees this day. And so I was like, boy, it's going to be really hot, right? And I'm even in the radio station, and that's the temperature that I'm reading outside is 100 degrees. And so when I got off work at 3 o'clock, the guy who came in after me was a fellow named Charlie Napier. And Charlie was there, and he said, "Okay, I'm here, man. It's all right." So I'm gone. So I start moseying my way home, and it's like hot, but it's not terrible to me because, see, I grew up on the East Coast where it can be 100 degrees and 80% humidity. That's hot. This was hot, but it was only like 25-30% humidity. It really wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, as long as you took it slow and stayed in the shade, and you'd be all right. I was having no problems. So I'm walking down the street, and All of a sudden, this car just screeches to a halt next to me, and it's Bob Spradlin, the guy who owns the radio station. And he says, "Get in the car." And I thought to myself, I've done something wrong. Did I forget something? Am I in trouble? So I said, okay, and I went and jumped in the car. He says, "What are you doing walking out here? It's this hot." I said, "It ain't that hot, Bob." But anyway, he was kind enough to drive me home. So Bob Spradlin and Dick Moon were kind of rough-edged radio guys, and Dick Moon was a very interesting character. He was a preacher of some sort. I don't know exactly what denomination it was. Presbyterian, I think, and or retired preacher who was doing radio on the side, and maybe he was doing something with the church on Sunday. I have no idea. And he just had a very interesting view on the world. And he was kind of, like I said, this great big rough and gruff kind of guy. And he had been in and out of the business for years, and he knew a lot of people in Nashville, and he knew a lot about music. And this was a country radio station, which was new to me. I wasn't really too keen about being on a country station, but it's radio. You do what you got to do. And I actually found out that there was a lot of things going on in country music that I liked at that time. And so it broadened my horizons. When I was a little boy, my dad used to listen to a lot of country, so I heard it back then. But then by the time I was in high school, what am I, 17 here? I'm like, man, I'm into rock and roll, jazz. Country? Really? Come on. It's Kenny. In my mind, all country was like Kenny Rogers and Eddie Rabbitt and stuff like that. And those guys were still around, but then there was a lot of cool artists that I got introduced to, so that was really nice. And it was really a swinging summer. I went through a period of time, like I said, where I just wasn't getting any sleep. I fell asleep a couple of times. I slept in a couple of times, got that irate phone call. "Get up out of bed, get your feet on the floor. Where the hell are you? You got to get down here." I had to come down here and get on the air. And the guy who owned the place, Bob Spradlin, lived above it, had an apartment above the radio station. So sometimes when I would get up, I'd hear Bob moving around, and he would come downstairs. Just about the time that I got used to what I was doing, the internship was over, and I found myself on a plane back home. It was the first time that I had ever been away from home for any period of time. And the first time that I was just really off the chain and could do whatever I wanted to. And fortunately, I didn't get into any trouble, and nobody got pregnant. And, all's well that ends well. That's about all I'm going to say about that. The radio station itself was very interesting. The equipment in there was all old. The board that you're looking at was handmade by an engineer named Sean E. Young. I remember that name because he had signed the meter there. You can't see it in the picture, but he had signed his name in there. And they were kind of neat little 8-channel boards, and then it had its own phone interface in it, which was nice. We had a 3-stack Harris cart machine, which you can just see over my shoulder. There's only one speaker because this is a AM radio station in mono. There were 2 turntables that were to my left there. They were QRK turntables with Stanton 500 cartridges on them. First time that I ever got introduced to working with a Stanton 500, and I'm still a fan today. And they had a production studio that had another board like that in it, and that one was really sparse. There was like 1 turntable, and there was a tape recorder, and there was a cassette recorder, and a cart machine, and that was about it. But we kept it hopping. They had a very full log at this radio station. One of the things that I did there when I was not sitting in the studio pushing buttons and turning knobs to make things go on the air was sit back in the production room and put a lot of commercials on to cartridge to put on the air. The audio got out of the building by phone line. Everything that happened with this radio station was done with phone lines. The transmitter was just slightly out of town, and so therefore we had a high-fidelity phone line that ran from the radio station to the transmitter that carried the signal, and then out at the transmitter there was a satellite dish, and that picked up ABC News, and so that went down another phone line to get back to the studio in downtown Berea. I guess it was cheaper and easier than using microwave links, and it worked out. It worked really well. It actually sounded pretty good on the air too. It was a pretty decent sounding radio station. And no, there was no CD player anywhere in the building. It was all records. And like I said, we would alternate between carts and records, and that's what was on the air. Now, there's a rack that you can't see here that had a tape recorder in it, and we also had the emergency broadcast receiver there. At that time, in the United States, there was a system called EBS, the Emergency Broadcast System, and every radio station had to have the receiver, and they had to monitor the local EBS station, and you could create in case of a national emergency, you could create this big chain of radio stations rebroadcasting each other, and it was a very interesting system. So that was there, and that was basically it. This was a super basic radio station. I took a quick look at Wikipedia for WKXO. Apparently, they are still on the air, and it is still licensed to Berea. They have an FM translator these days at 103.5, and it appears that they're doing some sort of news talk sort of thing. When I was there, it was country, way back a long time ago, and it lists the first time it was on the air as September the 1st, 1971. Somewhere here on YouTube a while back, there was a air check that popped up of WKXO from back in the 70s when they were playing top 40 rock and roll type music. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of information here. But when I was there, it was all by itself, and now it seems to be in a group of stations that includes WEKY, which is in Richmond, Kentucky. So that's the way it's gone over the last 30-something years anyway, is all the frequencies and the ownerships, and they've swapped back and forth, and I'm actually surprised that the call letters still exist. Thank you for listening. We're going to do another one of these real soon. I've got a whole bunch of stories to tell. If you like what you're hearing here, be sure and subscribe, and make sure you have your notifications on so you'll get new videos, and share it with your friends. If you're a radio junkie and you know other radio junkies that might be interested in hearing about some of this stuff, pass it on. I certainly would appreciate it. Thanks for watching.